Do you know what really changed British spending habits? More than Brexit, more than the pandemic, more than any single budget speech? It wasn't one policy. It wasn't one crisis. It was the slow, awkward moment when millions of Britons stood in a supermarket aisle, stared at a familiar product, and said, "Hang on, this used to be cheaper." That moment, mundane, almost comic, is where inflation stopped being an abstract headline and became personal. No flashing sirens, no dramatic collapse, just a receipt that felt longer than it should. Tonight, we're not talking about inflation as an economic statistic. We're talking about inflation as a social force, one that quietly rewired how Britain eats, heats, socializes, borrows, dreams, and plans. And why this matters not just for the UK, but for the US, Europe, and emerging economies watching closely. Before we begin, a small request. If this video makes you nod, laugh, or stare at your ceiling questioning modern life, consider liking and subscribing. Think of it as a very low-interest loan. 1. Inflation as a quiet shock to daily life. The most powerful economic shocks are rarely loud. Inflation in Britain did not arrive with collapsing banks, emergency broadcasts, or queues outside cash machines. It arrived quietly, politely, almost apologetically. It slipped into daily life through slightly higher grocery totals, energy bills that felt oddly heavier than usual, and transport fares that rose just fast enough to be annoying, but not fast enough to spark outrage. At first, many households assumed it was temporary. A blip, a phase. Britain had spent decades in an era where prices moved slowly and predictably, where inflation existed mostly as a topic for economists and central bankers, not dinner table conversations. That long period of stability trained people to expect normality. When normality cracked, behavior changed before awareness did. Inflation worked on habits before it worked on opinions. People didn't wake up one morning declaring themselves frugal. They simply began adjusting without consciously naming the cause. A brand skipped here. A subscription canceled there. A moment of hesitation before adding an item to an online basket. These micro-decisions accumulated into a structural shift in consumption. Spending habits were no longer guided by routine, but by quiet calculation. The British consumer, long accustomed to smooth economic surfaces, suddenly encountered friction everywhere. What made this shift particularly destabilizing was its ambiguity. Wages rose, but not enough. Employment remained relatively high, yet living standards felt under pressure. Official numbers lagged lived experience. Inflation became a background hum, always present, rarely dramatic, but impossible to ignore. This is where mainstream coverage often misses the point. Inflation's real power is not in extreme episodes, but in sustained uncertainty. When people stop trusting tomorrow's prices, they stop behaving like yesterday's consumers. Globally, this matters because Britain's experience mirrors what many emerging economies have lived with for decades. Volatility trains populations to think defensively. In the US and much of Europe, inflation had been tamed for so long that societies forgot how quickly behavior can change once price stability is questioned. Britain became a case study in how even moderate inflation can psychologically reshape a population conditioned for predictability. The quiet shock also altered expectations of institutions. Governments promised relief. Central banks promised control. But households learned something more basic. No one could guarantee stability. This realization did not cause panic. It caused caution. And caution, once learned, is remarkably persistent. This was the moment inflation stopped being an abstract macroeconomic concept and became a daily decision-making framework. Not a crisis that demanded headlines, but a pressure that rewired habits invisibly. And the first place where this rewiring became unmistakable was not in housing or finance, but somewhere far more ordinary. The supermarket as the first battleground. If inflation has a physical location, it is the supermarket. This is where abstract percentages turn into visible trade-offs, where households confront the reality of shrinking purchasing power in fluorescent lighting. In Britain, Supermarkets became the front line where inflation announced itself clearly and repeatedly, not through one shocking price jump, but through the cumulative effect of many small increases that felt impossible to explain away. Shopping behavior began to change almost immediately. Familiar brands, once purchased automatically, were suddenly reconsidered. Own-brand products, previously treated as compromises, became default choices across income groups. This shift was not driven by ideology or lifestyle trends. It was driven by arithmetic. Unit prices were scrutinized. Promotions dictated meal planning. Impulse buying, the lifeblood of modern retail, quietly declined. What's often overlooked is how psychologically destabilizing this was for the British middle class. For lower-income households, careful food budgeting had long been a necessity. For the middle, it represented a loss of comfort and predictability. The weekly shop, once routine and reassuring, became a calculation exercise. Abundance gave way to assessment. Choice narrowed not because shelves were empty, but because budgets were tighter. Historically, food inflation has always been politically sensitive. Across the global South, rising food prices have triggered unrest precisely because food spending is non-negotiable. Britain was not facing unrest, but it was experiencing a mild version of the same pressure. When food absorbs a growing share of income, everything else must adjust. Leisure, savings, and discretionary spending all compete for what remains. The contradiction here is striking. Britain still describes itself as a consumption-driven economy, yet food inflation exposed how thin the margin for that consumption really was. Years of stagnant real wages left households vulnerable. Inflation did not create the weakness, it revealed it. Supermarkets became mirrors reflecting structural fragility rather than temporary inconvenience. Globally, this pattern aligned Britain more closely with economies it rarely compares itself to. In emerging markets, brand switching, portion control, and promotion-driven consumption are normal responses to volatility. Britain's shift suggested not decline, but convergence, a reminder that economic comfort is conditional, not permanent. Supermarkets also became places of subtle social learning. People noticed others making similar choices, reducing stigma around cost-cutting. Frugality became normalized, even among those who once prided themselves on choice. Inflation, without announcing itself, rewrote consumer norms. And yet, food was only the beginning. If supermarkets revealed inflation, energy costs transformed it into something far more intrusive. Energy costs and the redefinition of home comfort. There are few expenses as emotionally charged as energy. Food can be adjusted. Leisure can be postponed. But heat and light sit at the core of daily life. When energy prices rose sharply in Britain, inflation crossed a psychological threshold. This was no longer about lifestyle choices. It was about comfort, health, and dignity. For decades, heating a home was an automatic act. Thermostats were adjusted without thought. Radiators hummed in the background of winter life. Inflation ended that automation. Heating became intentional, timed, restricted. Rooms were closed off. Extra layers replaced extra degrees. British households quietly relearned habits that had faded since the mid-20th century. Spending shifted accordingly. Money flowed into insulation, draft-proofing, thicker curtains, and smart meters. Not as green statements, but as survival strategies. Energy efficiency stopped being aspirational and became practical. This distinction matters. Inflation does not inspire virtue. It enforces adaptation. What mainstream narratives often miss is how deeply this changed the meaning of home. The home transformed from a space of passive comfort into an active site of cost management. Every kilowatt hour carried weight. Utility spending was no longer invisible. It was monitored. This fostered a culture of restraint that extended beyond energy into other areas of consumption. Globally, this shift aligned Britain with countries where energy insecurity is normal. In parts of Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, managing power use is a daily reality. Britain briefly experienced what it means when basic services feel conditional rather than guaranteed. The result was not chaos, but recalibration. There is also a distributional angle often overlooked. Older households, often in less efficient housing, felt the pressure more acutely. Renters had limited ability to invest in efficiency. Homeowners with capital could adapt more easily. Inflation did not hit evenly. It followed existing inequalities. Energy inflation also revealed a systemic truth. Modern economies assume cheap, stable energy. When that assumption breaks, behavior changes rapidly. Productivity, comfort, and even social life are affected. Britain's experience offered a preview of what energy volatility could mean globally in an era of geopolitical tension and transition. As energy absorbed more of household budgets, something had to give. And what gave first was not survival spending, but enjoyment. The decline of discretionary spending. Discretionary spending is where an economy reveals its mood. When confidence is high, it flourishes. When uncertainty grows, it retreats quietly. In Britain, inflation triggered not a collapse in discretionary spending, but a steady withdrawal. Nights out became occasional treats rather than habits. Holidays were shortened, postponed, or replaced with staycations. Non-essential retail felt the slowdown almost immediately. What's important is that this was not framed by households as sacrifice. It was framed as prudence. Inflation reshaped values subtly. Repair replaced replacement. Secondhand purchases lost their stigma and gained practicality. Entertainment became smaller, closer to home, and less costly. Leisure didn't disappear, it adapted. The British High Street reflected this shift. Businesses dependent on impulse and volume struggled. Those offering durability, value, or affordability fare better. This was not a typical recessionary pattern. Employment remained relatively stable, but spending behavior changed anyway. That contradiction confused policymakers and commentators alike. Historically, similar patterns have followed inflationary episodes elsewhere. After the Eurozone crisis, Southern European households permanently reduced discretionary spending even when growth returned. Once habits adjust downward, they rarely rebound fully. Inflation teaches consumers caution, and caution tends to stick. The overlooked truth here is that discretionary spending is not just about income. It is about trust. When people stop trusting prices, they stop committing to non-essential purchases. Big-ticket items are delayed. Experiences are simplified. The future feels less predictable, so the present becomes more restrained. Globally, this matters because discretionary spending drives large parts of advanced economies. Britain's adjustment signaled vulnerability not only domestically, but structurally. An economy reliant on consumption becomes fragile when consumers become cautious. There was also a social recalibration. Visible spending became less important as a marker of participation. Modest plans became normal. Expectations adjusted quietly, without protest. Inflation did not spark anger here. It normalized restraint. By the end of this phase, something fundamental had shifted. British households were no longer spending on autopilot. Every category was evaluated, every choice weighed. And as discretionary spending declined, many households turned to a familiar buffer. Not optimism, but credit. Credit as a coping mechanism. When inflation tightens household budgets, spending does not simply disappear. It looks for new routes. In Britain, credit became that route. Credit cards, overdrafts, and buy now pay later schemes increasingly filled the gap between incomes that lag and prices that refuse to slow. This shift was not driven by confidence or optimism. It was defensive. Households were not borrowing to upgrade lifestyles, but to preserve routines that had once felt normal. What makes this moment significant is how quietly it unfolded. Britain has long normalized consumer credit, but inflation changed its purpose. Credit moved from convenience to necessity. Everyday expenses, groceries, energy bills, school costs, were increasingly smoothed over with short-term borrowing. This masked the depth of pressure households were under. On the surface, consumption appeared resilient. Beneath it, vulnerability was accumulating. Historically, this pattern is familiar. In the United States, credit has often acted as a shock absorber during periods of real wage stagnation. In emerging markets, reliance on informal credit plays a similar role, though often with harsher consequences. Britain's experience sat somewhere in between. Access to credit prevented sudden collapse, but it also postponed adjustment. Inflation's cost was deferred, not avoided. The overlooked truth is that credit-fueled stability can be misleading. It creates the appearance of normality while quietly transferring risk into the future. Rising interest rates compounded this effect. As borrowing costs increased, households faced a double pressure: higher prices and more expensive debt. What had once been a buffer began to feel like a trap. There are also clear winners and losers. Financial institutions benefited from increased lending and higher interest margins. Households with strong credit histories could smooth shocks more easily. Those already stretched found themselves paying more to stand still. Inflation did not equalize. It amplified existing financial hierarchies. This shift also altered attitudes toward debt. Borrowing lost much of its stigma, particularly among younger households. At the same time, anxiety around debt increased. Credit was used, but rarely celebrated. It became a tool of necessity, not aspiration. Globally, Britain's reliance on credit during inflation offered a cautionary lesson. Advanced financial systems can absorb shocks smoothly, but they do not eliminate them. They redistribute them across time. And time, in economics, always comes with interest. As households leaned more heavily on credit, another pressure intensified simultaneously: housing costs. And unlike groceries or energy use, housing offered far fewer options for adjustment. Housing costs and lifestyle compression. Housing has long been the largest expense for British households, but inflation transformed it from a heavy weight into a dominating force. Rising rents and mortgage payments absorbed increasing shares of income, leaving less room for everything else. Unlike discretionary spending, housing costs are difficult to reduce quickly. This rigidity made them especially powerful in reshaping behavior. For renters, inflation translated into insecurity. Lease renewals brought sharp increases. Moving became expensive and uncertain. Many accepted higher costs simply to avoid disruption. For homeowners, rising interest rates turned mortgages into moving targets. Monthly payments climbed, often unexpectedly, forcing difficult reassessments of budgets. The result was lifestyle compression. Younger adults delayed moving out or return home. Families postponed upgrading to larger homes. Commuting distances increased as people traded time for affordability. These were not temporary decisions. They reshaped life trajectories. Historically, housing inflation has always carried social consequences. In the U.S., it has driven suburbanization and long commutes. In emerging economies, it has fueled informal housing growth. In Britain, it intensified generational divides. Older homeowners, often insulated by fixed-rate mortgages or outright ownership, experienced less pressure. Younger households bore the brunt. The contradiction is stark. Housing is treated simultaneously as shelter and as an investment vehicle. Inflation exposed the tension between these roles. As asset values rose, affordability fell. Stability, for some, came at the cost of flexibility for others. This dynamic also influenced spending psychology. When housing consumes more income, households become risk-averse elsewhere. Big purchases feel dangerous. Saving becomes harder. Long-term planning narrows. Inflation thus reshaped not only budgets, but ambition. Globally, Britain's housing pressures mirrored those in many advanced economies. Cities from Toronto to Sydney faced similar dynamics. The lesson is consistent. When housing costs rise faster than incomes, consumption patterns across the economy adjust downward. Housing inflation also reinforced dependence on credit and family support. Intergenerational transfers became more important. Inequality widened quietly, without spectacle. As housing compressed lifestyles, trust began to erode elsewhere too, particularly in brands and institutions that once promised value and stability. Shifts in brand loyalty and trust. Inflation has a corrosive effect on trust. In Britain, it weakened long-standing relationships between consumers and brands. Price increases, even when justified, broke habits built over decades. Loyalty gave way to scrutiny. Familiarity lost its premium. Consumers became more analytical. Unit pricing, discount cycles, and alternative retailers were compared carefully. Apps replaced brand memory. Marketing claims were met with skepticism rather than enthusiasm. The emotional side of consumption receded, replaced by calculation. This shift mattered because brand loyalty is not just a marketing concept. It underpins pricing power. Inflation stripped that power away. Companies that raised prices without clear explanations lost customers quickly. Those that communicated transparently or offered genuine value retained trust. The overlooked truth here is that inflation accelerates rational behavior. It does not make consumers angrier. It makes them colder. Decision-making becomes transactional. Identity-driven consumption weakens. Globally, this aligns Britain with markets where volatility has long shaped behavior. In parts of Africa and Latin America, consumers rarely assume stability. Brands must constantly earn relevance. Inflation nudged Britain closer to that mindset. There were winners. Discount retailers, resale platforms, and value-focused brands thrived. Losers included mid-market brands built on habit rather than differentiation. Inflation acted as a sorting mechanism, exposing which businesses offered real value and which relied on inertia. This shift also changed how people perceive corporations. Price rises were no longer abstract. They were personal. Trust became fragile. Once broken, it was hard to rebuild. As brand loyalty faded, social expectations shifted too. Consumption became less about signaling and more about sufficiency. That change extended beyond shopping into how people socialize. Social life under financial pressure. Spending is never purely economic. It is social, cultural, and symbolic. Inflation reshaped British social life not through prohibition, but through quiet adjustment. Meeting friends increasingly meant coffee instead of dinner, walks instead of events, homes instead of venues. Social rituals adapted to financial reality. Gift-giving changed tone. Extravagance felt inappropriate. Thoughtfulness replaced display. Celebrations were scaled back, not canceled. These shifts altered norms subtly, without formal agreement. Frugality became socially acceptable across classes. The overlooked truth is that inflation reshapes culture before policy responds. Social expectations adjust faster than institutions. What once felt like deprivation became normal behavior. Historically, societies under sustained economic pressure develop new norms of participation. In emerging markets, social life often centers on low-cost, communal activities. Britain experienced a mild version of this recalibration. There was also an emotional component. People became more open about financial limits. The stigma around saying no softened. Inflation created a shared constraint that leveled social expectations, at least temporarily. However, not all effects were equal. Those with disposable income retained choice. Others adjusted more sharply. Social networks subtly reorganized around affordability. Inflation also changed how people valued time. Home gatherings increased. Convenience lost some appeal. Slower, cheaper interactions gained ground. This social adaptation reinforced the broader spending shift. Consumption became less performative and more functional. Inflation did not isolate people, but it changed how connection was expressed. By this stage, British spending habits had been fundamentally rewired. The changes were not dramatic, but they were deep, and they set the stage for inflation's most enduring impact, not on prices, but on psychology and confidence. Psychological effects and consumer confidence. By the time inflation had reshaped food choices, energy use, housing decisions, credit reliance, and social life, its most enduring impact was already taking hold: psychological. Inflation does not need to remain high to change behavior. It only needs to be remembered. In Britain, the experience of persistent price increases altered how people felt about money, stability, and the future itself. Confidence is built on predictability. When prices rise unpredictably, trust erodes, not just in markets, but in expectations. British households began to behave as if volatility were permanent, even when headline inflation showed signs of easing. Big purchases were delayed. Long-term commitments were approached cautiously. The default mindset shifted from optimism to defense. This psychological shift is often misunderstood. It is not panic or fear. It is recalibration. Consumers stop assuming progress and start planning for resilience. Inflation teaches people that tomorrow may not be cheaper, easier, or more manageable than today. That lesson lingers. Historically, this pattern has appeared after inflationary episodes worldwide. In the United States during the 1970s, consumer behavior remained cautious long after inflation subsided. In emerging markets, where inflation is often recurring, households learn early to prioritize liquidity and flexibility. Britain's experience, though milder, followed the same logic. The overlooked truth is that central banks can influence prices, but restoring confidence takes longer. People remember the shock longer than the statistics. Once trust and stability is broken, it is rebuilt slowly, if at all. This had practical consequences. Savings behavior changed. Some households saved more defensively. Others saved less because higher costs left little room. Either way, spending became more deliberate. Purchases required justification. Even leisure spending carried a mental calculation that had not existed before. There were winners and losers in this shift. Households with buffers could afford caution. Those without were forced into constant trade-offs, heightening stress. Inflation did not just redistribute money. It redistributed peace of mind. Globally, this matters because consumer confidence drives economic momentum. When populations adopt a defensive posture, growth slows even without crisis. Britain's experience showed how psychological damage can outlast economic recovery. By this stage, inflation was no longer a temporary disruption. It had become a reference point. And from that reference point, a new spending culture began to crystallize, one that may define Britain for years to come. A new spending culture takes shape. Inflation did not simply distort British spending habits. It reorganized them. By the time prices stabilized, behavior had already shifted. The era of automatic consumption, spending guided by habit rather than thought, had faded. In its place emerged a culture of scrutiny, restraint, and adaptation. Spending became intentional. Consumers questioned value more than brand. Durability mattered more than novelty. Flexibility mattered more than status. These were not moral choices. They were learned responses to instability. Inflation trained households to expect friction, and they adjusted accordingly. This shift mirrors long-term transformation seen in other economies after inflationary shocks. Once consumers internalize caution, it rarely disappears entirely. Even when incomes rise, the memory of vulnerability shapes behavior. Britain's consumers did not become pessimistic. They became realistic. The overlooked systemic truth is that inflation accelerates transitions already underway. Trends towards secondhand markets, subscription fatigue, and experience-like consumption existed before inflation. Rising prices simply made them unavoidable. There are consequences. Retail adapts toward value. Services simplify. Growth becomes harder to generate through consumption alone. For policymakers, this presents a challenge. Stimulus becomes less effective when households prioritize security over spending. Globally, Britain's shift carries lessons. Advanced economies are not immune to behavioral change. Stability is a privilege, not a constant. Emerging markets, long accustomed to volatility, understand this intuitively. Britain had to relearn it. Over the next decade, This spending culture will shape everything from housing demand to political expectations. Not through collapse, but through restraint. The economy will still function, but differently. Quieter, more cautious, less expressive through consumption. The unsettling takeaway is this. Inflation's greatest power is not in how much prices rise, but in how it changes behavior. Once people learn to expect instability, they never fully unlearn it. And that is why inflation reshaped British spending habits so profoundly, not as a crisis, but as a lesson.